This is going to be twice as nice. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today we're going to do a twice turning. Now this bowl has been turned once into this shape that you see, and it's been allowed to sit and dry or equalize. This was turned about 3 years ago. You can see a little bit of movement in the rim there. And we're going to do the twice turning today. Now, why would we go through all this trouble to turn a bowl twice? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, when we're dealing with wood turning bowls, we need big chunks of wood. Wood that's not like the flat wood that you would buy in a lumber yard. Instead, we're using very large, dense pieces of wood. If you could take a piece of wood like this and dry it completely before turning a bowl, that would be quite a feat because it would take a lot of equipment, or it would take a long period of time and a lot of luck, because large sections of wood like this or logs like this left to dry on their own typically crack and break apart because they're part of a tree that's trying to decompose and break back down into the earth. Instead, what we want to do is we want to turn the wood when it's still green and easy to turn, so it's easy for us. And we get it down to a denseness or a thickness that's pretty manageable. In this case, it's just a little over an inch thick throughout. And this has been allowed to dry and cure over the last several years. So now it's relatively equalized, meaning the wood or the moisture content has been reduced dramatically. And it's also stabilized because that moisture is now out of it. So any movement that was going to occur with this bowl has already occurred. The nice thing about that is when we put it back on the lathe now and turn it, it's not going to have movement, meaning it's not going to warp and distort after we get done with this second turning. Instead, it's going to be nice and true and round, and it's going to maintain that round shape for the rest of its life. That's why we twice turn, because we are managing this large piece of wood and taking it down from a wet state to a dry state in a controlled manner so that it doesn't crack and distort dramatically. And the nice result of that is we'll have a really round bowl when we're done. It's quite that simple. Now, there are many steps in the process of taking trees to bowls, and that's why I've got a course online that you might want to check out. It's called Tree to Bowl, Understanding Green Wood. And in this course, we go over everything you're going to need to know to understand how to process raw wood and turn it into the bowls that you imagine. So check out that course to thoroughly understand this entire process. The first thing I'm going to do with this large once turned bowl is I'm going to mount it to the lathe using a large flat jam chuck. And I'm going to go get that now, and we're going to get this on the lathe. This jam chuck, of course, is homemade. This is from a design that I got from Glenn Lucas. It's essentially two pieces of plywood, one circle disc and a second circle disc with the center cut out, and then rubber padding applied to that. Now that gap in the center is perfect for the pith area of the bowl to seat down inside there. That whole thing is mounted to a faceplate, and I keep that faceplate mounted permanently so I can use this at any given moment. First thing I'm going to use is my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge, and I'm going to clean up the face of this tenon just to smooth that out. Now remember, this has been sitting for 3 years and it is warped and distorted a bit, so there's really nothing perfectly straight or true with it. So I want to straighten everything out. I'm going to go ahead and mark the new tenon. You can see the previous tenon I made was a large tenon, which would give me plenty of extra material to shape down to the tenon that I'm using now. So I'm going to cut the cylinder for the tenon, and then I will do the same for the shoulder. I'm going to bring that in. I'm essentially going to shape the shoulder so that it will become the foot of the bowl. Now this is a different type of turning. If you're used to turning green wood that is either really wet or has some moisture content, it's somewhat odd to turn a piece that has equalized, because dry wood is a completely different experience. It's a harder surface to cut, It's not a bad thing. It's not impossible. Basically, just need to make sure you're keeping your tools sharp at all times. And because of the dryness, there's a lot of heat and friction that builds up with the tool. The end of the tool gets very hot, and the shavings coming off are incredibly hot as well. I get a lot of comments about the glove that I wear. A lot of people are really worried that I'm going to get that caught up in the bowl or something, but quite honestly, there's no reason for your hand to be on the other side of that tool rest. And as long as the bowl's rotating, it's not touching that tool rest. But the side of my left hand pushing that tool down onto the tool rest is taking a lot of impact from these shavings. And the shavings, if you just had a little bit of shavings coming off for a little bit, the heat wouldn't be so bad. But the continuous hot shavings coming off of it turning like this can be a little bit unbearable after a while. So it's nice to have that glove on for a little added protection. Okay, so I'm shaping the exterior of the bowl. I've trued up the tenon and the shoulder, and I'm working from the base up to the rim. Now, I'm not going to be able to work right up to the rim because of that padding on the jam chuck. What I'm doing is I'm really taking my time and looking at this shape and forming this piece. I've got a little bump there towards the bottom that I'll deal with in a second. But I need to remove material up here towards the top. Now, it's a little hard to see, but there's an unevenness as far as the surface area. There's a high spot and a low spot, and that's due to the nature of how a wood bowl dries. What happens is the pith area appears to extend outward, but what's really happening is the sidewalls contract. They pull themselves inward. So if you were to take a tape measure and measure across the sides from one side to another, that distance is typically shorter than if you measured from the pith ends across the bowl. And that's because the bowl contracts from the sides. Well, that contraction makes these turn in a non-circular form. So there's going to be two high spots and two low spots. So we need to even those out. And that's what I'm doing right here. And you can see there's quite a bit of material coming off this bowl, which is fine because the wall thickness is pretty thick. And it's also why we turn the initial first turning relatively thick. When I say relatively thick, the rule of thumb is 10% of the total diameter of the bowl. So if the bowl is a 10-inch diameter bowl, we try to make the wall thickness 1 inch. If it's a 15-inch bowl, then it's going to be about a 1.5-inch thick wall. If we go with a really thin wall and the sides contract too far and we put it back on the lathe like we're doing now, we'll essentially just turn through the thin spot and we won't have enough material to make a bowl. Now I'm taking my time and I'm making sure that I've got the exterior shape that I really want for this bowl. As you know, I like to refer to the outside of the bowl or the exterior of the bowl is the bowl. It's what we see. It's what makes a first impression on us. It's what we touch. It's everything. And essentially, the interior of the bowl just mimics the exterior of the bowl. So you really want to take your time and get the exterior exactly the way you'd like. It's worth taking the extra time to finesse those high spots and low spots and get a nice fluid curve. You can see I'm leaving the material up towards the rim. That'll, like I said, that'll get all dealt with when I flip the bowl around. Here I'm using a shear scrape to take down some high spots near the base of the bowl. This is the best way too. If you have tailstock on your bowl that's in the way of your tool and you can't start a push cut, it's almost impossible to start a push cut up against the shoulder or the foot of the bowl. But what you can do is you can do a scrape cut, which is what you're seeing here, but with less of an angle. You can do that to remove material, and then you can drop the handle like you're seeing there, and that will shear scrape and leave these really fine shavings, and that just smooths out any high spots. Okay, so I'm going to use my spindle detail gouge. and I'm going to shape the angle for the dovetails for the tenon. I want to make sure that little crevice in the base of that is cleaned out real nice. And now we're done with the exterior of the bowl. I'm going to flip this around. We'll get the chuck off the lathe. There you can see the faceplate and how that's attached. And now that we have the tenon all cleaned up, we can mount the bowl to the 4-jaw chuck directly. Remember, when you're making tenons for your bowls, the tenon never seats all the way to the bottom of the chuck. It needs to sit on top of the jaws of the chuck, and that's it. I've got an article on my website all about the 4-jaw chuck. If you've got any questions about that, you're really going to want to check that out. There's a lot of information there. Okay, so I'm going to make this a closed-rimmed bowl, meaning the rim will be narrower than the widest part of the bowl. And when I say that, it's going to be very subtle. It may not even be noticeable hardly at first, but essentially the rim is just going to be a little bit narrower than the widest part of the bowl. That's a personal preference of mine and the aesthetic. So in order to cut this properly, I'm starting from the rim up and I'm going to the high spot. If you saw my video about supported grain direction, you know exactly what I'm doing here. It was part of the trick question in that video. If you haven't seen that video, you might want to check it out. You need to check it out, especially if you're having difficulty understanding supported grain cuts. It's very important to understand the proper direction so that you get good clean cuts every time with the bowl gouge. Okay, here I'm using a kind of a combination of a scrape cut and a shear scrape. Shear scrape is when the handle's dropped at about a 45-degree angle like you're seeing there. And then a scrape cut, the tool can be more horizontal. It's just scraping away material and it's doing it relatively rough. So you want to be careful when you're doing the scrape cut because it will tear up material. However, the shear scrape with the handle dropped at about a 45-degree angle really does a good job for smoothing out the surface. Okay, so now that the exterior of the bowl is trued up, you can see that difference on the inside. You can see the narrow sidewalls and the thicker pith area. And that has to do with that expansion and contraction of the sidewalls coming in. So I'm going to take my time with my 1/2-inch 55-degree bevel swept-back bowl gouge, and I'm going to clean up the rim. And then I'm going to start establishing the wall thickness. I'm just going to remove a small amount of material. You can actually see how the material is being cut in one area and not on another. And that's because of that variation in the wall thickness. Okay, so I'm going to continue to narrow this down until we get to the thinnest part of the wall. And that's going to give me my wall thickness. I need to establish that wall thickness as soon as possible. And then I'm simply going to move down the interior of the bowl and maintain that wall thickness as I continue. I really want to make clean, simple cuts here. Now, what I'm not showing you guys because it's a little bit boring is that I'm going to the sharpening station pretty frequently here. Probably about every 8 to 10 minutes. What you want to do is you want to come from the sharpening station and really pay attention to how the edge of your bowl gouge is cutting. Get a sense of how much pressure you're applying to the tool or how little pressure you're applying to the tool, and the overall reaction of the tool, how well it's cutting material. And once you understand that state right from coming from the sharpening station, remember that. It's tricky because the sharp edge on the gouge degrades slowly. Unless you hit a nail. I've hit nails before, and then it degrades really fast. But in general, the sharp edge of the bowl gouge degrades pretty slow. So it's kind of like watching your kids grow old. You don't really see it day to day. but other people see it because they're only seeing your kids every month or so, if that makes any sense. Essentially, what happens is you need to recognize that your cutting edge has changed and it's not cutting as smoothly or with as little effort as it did when you first came back from sharpening. And the real trick is to notice that before it gets to the point where it's really that noticeable, and then go back and resharpen. Yeah, you do need to resharpen your tools quite a bit with a dried, equalized piece of wood like this, because like I said, there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of heat buildup, and that wears down and dulls that sharp edge. And the only way to restore that is to resharpen. Okay, so I'm working down the interior wall and I'm maintaining the wall thickness as I go. I'm stopping and checking and making sure it's the thickness that I'm trying to get all the way down from where I started at the top. So at the top, the wall thickness is established. And as I work down, I really want to sneak up on that final wall thickness. I don't want to get too aggressive when I'm getting close to the thickness. I want to make shallow, light cuts like you're seeing here until I eventually make that lower wall the same thickness as the wall above it. If you get aggressive here, you can make the wall too thin, and obviously that's almost impossible to recover from, because if you have a thick wall up above, you don't want to have thinner wall below. So stop frequently, use your calipers, and check that wall thickness. Think about this in sections. You don't have to get all worked up about trying to make big passes and try to remove all the material at one time. It's a big deal to see turners that do that, where they'll make cuts that go all the way from the rim down to the bottom. That's fun to see as demonstrations, but it's not very practical, especially when you're turning larger pieces like this that are thin. Instead, it's better to work in sections and then blend those sections together so that they're seamlessly merged. And no one will know that you didn't turn it all in one pass. You can see here too that I'm using the bowl gouge in a very open stance. That flute is pointing almost straight up. Now that's a very delicate maneuver, and you do not want to do that when you're trying to remove material, because it'll become too much and it will overload the bowl gouge very quickly and result in a catch. This is a move with the flute open. You only want to do that when you're down to the last few passes and you're just removing a very light amount of material on the surface. Most cuts are going to be like this, where you can see I have the flute angled at about a 45-degree angle. That's a good position to make a decent cut. The tool is not taking on an overwhelming amount of material, and it's easily cutting through the surface as it moves across. The other nice thing about doing the open cut as your final cuts is it does remove that very thin layer that just blends everything together and gives you a nice smooth surface. It's not a cut that you're going to use very often, maybe 2% of the time, because it's really going to be the last cut. There you can see as I'm getting down and I'm making thinner passes, I'm opening the flute more and I'm using more of the center portion of the flute, but I'm also removing much less material. It's looking pretty good. Keep going back to that top wall thickness to use that as a reference to determine how the rest of the bowl is feeling. Now, as you can see, I've switched my tool rest to my extended J-shaped tool rest. This gives me a little bit more extension down into the bowl. and I'm still using my 1/2-inch bowl gouge, but I'm starting to pick up a little vibration. When I get down there, I don't really have the best support at this angle, and the 1/2-inch bowl gouge has the ability to flex a little bit more than my 5/8-inch bowl gouge. So I'm going to switch to my 5/8-inch bowl gouge here in just a moment. And you can see where I'm just rubbing the bevel to pick up the area and merge and blend these sections together. And I'm making very light passes, again with that flute in a very open position. But as I come into more material, I'm rotating that flute closed. Now I'm going to switch over to the 5/8-inch bowl gouge. I was getting too much movement there. And the problem with getting movement or a lack of support is you will create chatter. And chatter, if you feel your tool moving around at all, or worse, you hear it making a chattering sound, what you're hearing is you're hearing your tool actually making marks on your bowl. And those marks aren't usually very pretty. They're usually bumpy and random and not something you really want on a bowl. Now there are intentional chatter tools that are designed to make patterns and things like that, but that's not what we're doing at this moment. So the 5/8-inch bowl gouge is a little bit beefier and doesn't vibrate as much as the 1/2-inch bowl gouge. It's pretty amazing what a 1/2 inch or a 1/8 inch of steel will do. I think that's about 3 millimeters. If there's 25 millimeters in a centimeter or in an inch, that's pretty close to about 3 or 4 millimeters. So it's amazing that that little bit of steel will make that much difference, but there's no vibration in this tool that's noticeable. So I'm taking my time. As I'm pulling back to reset each cut, I'm just rubbing the heel and the bevel and merging up to the previous high spot and then making a very light pass to remove that. And if you notice here, as I come into the center of the bowl, I will rotate the tool to a closed position to the right and like a 3 o'clock position. So if the flute facing up is 12 o'clock, the flute facing to the right is 3 o'clock. I'm closing the flute right as I come down to the center, and that slows down the cutting process. What I don't want to do is I don't want to tear through that center. I don't want to go very fast through the middle, because if I do, I'm going to rip out those fibers. And that's obviously something that's not desirable as well. Okay, I'm switching back to my 1/2-inch bowl gouge. I have the majority of the material removed in the center. I just want to make a really nice clean pass here at the very end. And I'm doing that with an open flute position, as you're seeing. And then I'll close it right on the center there. That's looking really good. I'm liking the overall curve and shape. Now I've got this crack. Now this is a tension crack. This is pecan that I've been working with, this wood. And I've done a lot of work with pecan, and I know what its limitations are. If you were to see a crack like this in many other species of tree, you may be terrified. I've done enough work with pecan that I know that this probably is not going to go much farther. So what I'm going to do is I'm gluing this, I'm working glue down in that joint, and while the glue is still wet, I'm quickly hand sanding with the grain. So if you see the grain pattern there, I'm sanding with that grain pattern. And what's happening is I'm drying the glue and applying dust from the wood into it. So that crack just blends in and becomes almost seamless. It's a very simple technique for patching cracks like that. Now, as I was saying, I've worked with this wood quite a bit, and I know that it's not going to continue cracking like that. Unfortunately, because of that crack and because of the glue that's applied to it, I probably won't be selling this bowl, but this will see some love in our house, and it will probably see a lot of salads too. So I will put it to good use, even though it might not be something I would typically like to sell because of that crack. So it's just to let you guys know too that if you do have a crack in a piece that you're doing, don't be traumatized by it. You can quickly fill it and just let it do its thing. And if it depends on the species, if the crack continues, then it may be a problem, but this is one way that you can patch it. So I'm taking my time going through all the grits. I start at 120, and I go to 180, 220, and then 320. Always hand sanding across the center of the bowl. I've got a video all about sanding. You might want to check that out. Now, I'm going to apply tried and true original finish. This has linseed oil and beeswax and nothing else. That's it. I love this product because it's pure and simple and doesn't have any additives, and it's food safe. I know this bowl will be used with food. So the way this is applied is you apply a single coat and a relatively thin coat. You can see up close there that I do have quite a bit on here. What I do is I take all the excess and move that around and spread it around with the applicator, and then I will wipe off any thick excess of areas. The finish stays on the wood for 1 hour, and then you vigorously wipe it for any excess or any thick areas. Again, taking down any of those thick areas. If you can see finish on the wood, you have enough finish on it. You do not need a thick layer. So after that hour and after wiping that down, then we're going to wait 24 hours. And after 24 hours, then I'm going to burnish it. Look at the grain patterns. This is so cool. And this piece was turned into a bowl before it had a chance to spalt very much, but there is some spalt in there, which is pretty nice. You can see the black line spalt. That's so cool. It's looking great. It's always fun to put the finish on and see all the grain colors and textures come out. All right, so I'm going to let this rest for 24 hours. And when I come back, you can see that the shine from the finish has diminished a little bit. But we're going to use 4/0 steel wool and burnish this surface now. And the burnishing helps bring a little bit of a shine and luster back to this finish and really works it into the whole piece. You can actually see the reflection there improving as I'm burnishing this. So I'm taking 4/0 steel wool and just allowing it to work the surface. What the steel wool is doing is it's taking away any high spots or excess material, and it builds up in the steel wool, so you can basically pull it apart until you get a clean area exposed and then continue burnishing the finish. So it takes down any high spots and then it evenly spreads the rest of the material, so you have a really nice complete coated bowl when you're done. It's also why I like to leave the tenon on overnight, so I can really do this efficiently with the lathe on. So now that the finish has been burnished, we can finish up the foot of this bowl. I'm going to do that by using a jam chuck, and I use a piece of dense packing foam. It could be any material you have as long as it's even. This is just a small piece of even, dense packing foam. And you need to be careful that it's seated, that packing foam is seated, or whatever pad you're using is seated really evenly on that. Sometimes just that little foam inside, if it's pushed off to one side or another, you'll see a wobble here. And if you see that wobble and everything looks like it should be centered on the outside, go look inside and make sure that piece of padding is centered up. So I'm going to use some push cuts to remove the tenon. And like I mentioned earlier, the shoulder is going to become the foot. So I'm going to clean up the bottom of the foot here with just a really light cut. And then I like to make sure that I'm removing the interior of the foot. The ideal goal is to shape the inside of the foot as if the foot were not there. So the continuous curve of the bowl, if you can imagine that ring of the foot removed, the bowl should just flow right across the bottom in a continuous form. I'm taking my time. This very light, very dangerous cut here. If I were to allow any extra material to touch that tip and overload the bowl, I'm definitely going to get a catch. I was using the tip of that in a very open flute position like we talked about before, just to lightly shave away a very thin amount of material at a time. You do not want to get aggressive with the position of the bowl gouge like that. Now these push cuts into the headstock are great because they keep the tension inward towards the headstock. So you're not applying much force away from the rotation of the lathe. So I'm going to continue making push cuts to remove or reduce the size of the nub that's attached to the bowl. This is my 1/2 inch bowl gouge. Now I'm going to switch over to my spindle detail gouge, and I'll continue making that nub smaller. It's not a bad idea to take the lathe speed down just a bit here too. I want to make the bottom inside of that foot a continuous flowing curve as well. So you really want to watch that surface and make sure that it's evenly flowing. And that's what's nice about the spindle detail gouge. You can really get in there and deal with that. So this didn't break off right away. What you could do is with the lathe off, just apply forward pressure with the spindle detail gouge and hand rotate the bowl, and it will sever that nub. And it comes off just like that. Okay, so that area needs to be sanded a bit. Now the biggest thing you need to pay attention to here is not to let the disc of the sander touch the side rim or the foot of the bowl, because if it just touches that for a second, it's going to remove material and leave a little notch there. But you do want to rotate the bowl around so that you have a nice even sanded surface inside. So I'm going to use my wood burner and sign this. I like to sign it and put the wood species and the date on each of my bowls. And then what I'm going to do is apply finish to the bottom section of this bowl. And I have that little cloth as an applicator, but by the time I reach in there and grab it, I have so much finish on my finger that I can just do this entire area just by using my finger. So I'll obviously have to smooth this off and wipe off any excess so I have a nice thin layer, but that's essentially the easiest way to apply to a small area like that. And there it is. Look at all those patterns. Look at the colors, and there is quite a bit of spalt in there. It's very subtle, but it's absolutely gorgeous. I'm very happy with this piece. This is going to get put to good use. It's a beautiful bowl and quite impressive coming from where it started. I think this is at least twice as nice as the original once turn bowl that we started this project out with. Let's go back and take a look at that piece. Yeah, this is definitely a lot better, and it's actually pretty surprising. You can get a bowl that looks this great from a piece that's kind of not so attractive, but it's hiding inside there, and that's the beauty of doing twice turned. Also, did you see when I was buffing out the finish on the lathe after 24 hours? Did you see how true this turned? There was no wobble, there was nothing. It was turning perfectly true, which is another great indication that this wood is dry, or equalize is actually the term we want to use. So the beauty of twice turned is you're going to have this wonderful complete bowl that's not going to warp or change shape over time. It's already dried and equalized. There's nothing wrong with a once turned bowl. Those are very cool on their own. That's a totally different approach compared to the twice turned. Now I've got a course called Tree to Bowl Understanding Green Wood, and if you have any questions about how to prepare timber for turning on the lathe, whether somebody gives you a few pieces or if you have an entire treated process, you're going to want to check out this course, because I go over everything you need to know to prepare wood to make beautiful bowls like this. All right, guys, I hope you've liked this video. If you have, please click that like button. Thank you. And subscribe. If you turned twice turn bowls, let me know. Leave me a comment below. Let me know what your thoughts are. What do you prefer, once turn or twice turn bowls? I hope this video has showed you the benefits of doing twice turn bowls and the beauty that can be obtained from doing a twice turning. Also, if you don't have the time to wait, like the 3 years that I waited for this blank to cure or equalize, you can also speed up that process by using your microwave. Check out this video. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. And as always, until next time, happy turning. That's why we twice turn. That's why we try. Wada, wada, wada.